The host laughed into the microphone and said, "Eric Clapton saved your life. Come on. What did he do? Play Layla until the enemy surrendered." The veteran on the other end of the line said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "He gave me something to hear when I couldn't see anything anymore." The host laughed again. He cut the call. The next morning, at 8:53, the receptionist at Wake Up London looked up from her desk and saw Eric Clapton walking through the front door. The morning show was called Wake Up London, and it broadcast from a studio in Soho every weekday between 6 and 10 in the morning. The host's name was Peter Marsh, and he had been doing the show for 11 years with the particular confidence that comes from being told repeatedly and by multiple sources that what you are doing is working. He was quick, he was funny in the way that morning radio rewarded, and he had a gift for finding the comic angle in almost any situation that callers presented. This gift had served him well for 11 years. It served him poorly on the morning of April 3rd, 1996. The segment was called Your Song, Your Story, a regular feature in which listeners called in to describe a piece of music that had changed their lives. It was popular. It generated good call volume and occasionally produced the kind of genuinely moving radio that justified the segment's existence. Peter hosted it with the practiced warmth of a professional who understood that it required a different register than the rest of the show. He did not always maintain that register. The veteran had been on hold for 22 minutes when Peter took his call. His name was Harold Webb. He was 71 years old and lived alone in a flat in Bermondsey, South London. He had served in the British Army as a young man and had lost his sight in 1971 in circumstances that had divided his life into before and after with absolute finality. He had been blind for 25 years. He had called the show because the segment's topic was genuine, music that had changed a life, and he had something genuine to say. He said that he had lost his sight in 1971, that the years immediately following had been the hardest of his life, not only for the obvious practical reasons, but because losing sight meant losing the entire architecture of the world, the way space felt, the way a room or a street conveyed itself to a person accustomed to receiving that information visually. He said that in those years he had felt a profound disorientation that had nothing to do with being unable to find things and everything to do with no longer understanding where he was in the world. He said that Eric Clapton's music had helped him with this, that there was a quality to the way Clapton played that conveyed space and texture and emotional landscape in a way that helped him reconstruct internally a sense of where he was. He said this was difficult to explain, but was as true as anything he knew. Peter let him get through most of this. Then he said, "So Eric Clapton saved your life. Come on. What did he do? Play Layla until the enemy surrendered." There was a pause. Harold said, very quietly, "He gave me something to hear when I couldn't see anything anymore." Peter laughed. He said that was very poetic. He thanked Harold for calling. He cut the call. He moved on to the next segment. 3 miles away on the Thames embankment, Eric Clapton had the radio on. He had been listening to Wake Up London while driving to a morning appointment. He listened to the radio in the car the way many people did, with the partial attention of someone also doing something else. He caught the beginning of the Your Song, Your Story segment. He heard Harold's name. He listened. He heard the entire exchange. He heard Harold describe what the music had given him. He heard Peter's interruption. He heard the joke about Layla. He heard Harold's response. He heard Peter laugh. He heard the call cut off. He did not pull over. He did not reach for his phone. He continued driving, but the appointment he had been heading to was no longer where he was going. He made a turn he had not planned to make, and then another, and 12 minutes later he parked on a side street in Soho and walked to the address of the radio station that broadcast Wake Up London, which he knew because he had been a guest on a different show there 2 years earlier. He walked through the front door at 8:53 in the morning. The receptionist's name was Catherine, and she had worked the front desk of the station for 3 years and had developed the particular composure that front desk work in the media industry requires, the ability to greet anyone from any level of celebrity with the same professional warmth and the same calm efficiency. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at the man who had walked in. She said, "Good morning. Can I help you?" He said, "My name is Eric Clapton. I'd like to speak with Peter Marsh," Catherine said, with the professional composure that her 3 years had given her and that was now being tested in a way those 3 years had not fully prepared her for, that she would let the production team know he was there. She picked up her phone. She called the production office. She said quietly and carefully, "There's someone in reception. He says his name is Eric Clapton. He wants to speak with Peter. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The production office said, "Say that again." In the production office, a woman named Sandra had been monitoring the show's final hour with the divided attention of a producer managing the end of a broadcast, tracking the running order, monitoring call volume, keeping one eye on the clock. She took Catherine's call. She processed the information. She put the call on hold, walked to the window of the production office that overlooked the reception area, and looked down. She went back to the phone. She told Catherine to ask him to wait and that someone would be down immediately. Then she walked to the control room. Peter was 4 minutes from the end of his show. Sandra stood in the control room doorway and waited for the next ad break. When it came, she pushed open the door and said, "There's someone in reception who wants to talk to you. He's been waiting since 8:53. Peter said, "Who?" Sandra said, "Eric Clapton." Peter looked at her. He said, "Why?" Sandra said, "He heard Harold's call this morning. He drove here." There were 2 minutes and 40 seconds remaining in the ad break. Peter finished the show on autopilot, the sign-off he had given 1,100 times, the music, the station ID. When the on-air light went off, he sat for a moment at the desk. Then he took off his headphones and went downstairs. Clapton was standing in the reception area with the patient, unhurried quality of a man who had decided to be somewhere and was comfortable waiting for however long that required. He was not performing displeasure. He was not pacing. He was standing with his hands in the pockets of his dark navy jacket, looking at a framed photograph of the station's founders on the wall. He turned when he heard Peter come through the door. Peter said, "Mr. Clapton, Clapton said, "I heard your show this morning. I heard the veterans call." Peter said, "Yes." Clapton said he wasn't being poetic. What he described, the way music reconstructs a sense of space and orientation for someone who has lost their sight, that's real. I've heard it described in similar terms by other people. It's a specific and accurate thing he was trying to say. Peter said nothing. Clapton said, "He called your show because he had something true to say. He deserved to be listened to." The reception area was quiet. Catherine at the front desk was looking at her computer screen with the focused attention of someone who is very deliberately not listening to a conversation happening 6 feet away. Peter said, "You're right. I should have. I didn't handle that well." Clapton looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like Harold's contact information, if you kept it from the call." Peter said he would find out. He went back upstairs. Sandra had anticipated this. She had pulled Harold's number from the call system the moment she understood why Clapton was in the building. She handed it to Peter. Peter came back downstairs and gave it to Clapton. Clapton said thank you. He put the number in his pocket. He said it had been a pleasure to meet him, which Peter understood was not sarcasm. He walked back out through the front door and into the Soho morning. Peter stood in the reception area for a moment after the door closed. Catherine continued looking at her computer screen. The station's morning programming continued through the speakers in the ceiling. That evening, Harold Webb received a phone call. He did not recognize the number. He answered it. The voice on the other end said, "Mr. Webb, my name is Eric Clapton. I heard your call this morning, and I wanted to tell you that what you described was not poetic. It was accurate, and I'm grateful you said it." They spoke for nearly an hour. Harold said afterward, in a brief conversation with a local South London community paper, the only account he ever gave, that Clapton had asked him questions. Which recordings? Which passages? What specifically in the playing had produced the effect he had described on the radio? He said Clapton had listened to the answers with the attention of a musician trying to understand something true about his own work. Harold said he listened like it mattered, not like he was being kind, like it actually mattered to him. Peter Marsh continued hosting Wake Up London for another 4 years. He said in the only public account he gave of that morning that he had not handled Harold's call correctly and that he knew it the moment Clapton walked through the front door. He said that the specific quality of Clapton's presence in that reception area, unhurried, certain, not angry, but absolutely clear, was something he had thought about many times since. He said he had not laughed at a caller since. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the true things are always worth saying, because you never know who is listening, and you never know who might walk through the door. There is something worth sitting with in the image of Eric Clapton walking through the front door of a radio station at 8:53 in the morning because he heard something on the radio that required a response. Not a phone call, not a message through management, not a public statement, a physical presence, the decision to go somewhere, in person, and say something directly to the person who needed to hear it. This is not what famous people usually do. Famous people have systems for managing the distance between themselves and the things that affect them. Publicists, managers, intermediaries of various kinds, structures designed to ensure that the famous person's responses to the world are mediated, considered, strategically appropriate. These systems exist for good reasons. They protect the famous person's time and energy and public image. They prevent the kinds of impulsive, poorly considered responses that can cause damage. Clapton bypassed all of it. He heard something on the radio, made a turn he had not planned to make, parked on a side street in Soho, and walked through a door. He waited in a reception area, looking at a framed photograph on the wall while a show finished. He said what he had come to say in 4 short exchanges, gave no speech, accepted an apology without dwelling on it, asked for a phone number, said thank you, and left. The whole visit lasted less than 15 minutes. What it communicated in those 15 minutes was something that a phone call or a public statement could not have communicated in the same way, that what Harold had said on the radio that morning mattered enough to get in a car and drive to Soho and wait in a reception area for a show to end. That the specific true thing Harold had tried to say and been laughed at for saying was worth a physical journey. Harold did not know about the visit to the studio when Clapton called that evening. Clapton did not mention it. He called, introduced himself, said that what Harold had described was accurate and that he was grateful, and then asked questions and listened to the answers for nearly an hour. Harold found out about the studio visit later through the community paper's account and said that learning about it had surprised him. He said he didn't have to do any of that. He could have just, not. Most people would have just not. Ya está. This is the part of the story that stays, not the drama of it. Clapton arriving unannounced at a radio station is dramatic, but the drama is not the point. The point is the decision that preceded the drama. The decision made somewhere on the Thames embankment, in a car with the radio on, to respond to something wrong, not with a call to a publicist or a carefully worded statement, but with a turn of the steering wheel and a drive to Soho, because Harold had said something true. And the true thing had been laughed at and cut off. And Clapton, who knew the true thing was true because he had heard versions of it before and understood what Harold was describing, was in a position to do something about it. So he did. He parked the car. He walked through the door. He waited for the show to end. He said what needed to be said, briefly and without drama. He got a phone number. He called that evening and listened for an hour. Peter Marsh said he had not laughed at a caller since. That is one lesson. Harold said Clapton listened like it actually mattered to him. That is another. But the lesson that lives underneath both of them, the one that the 15 minutes in a Soho reception area carries, is simpler than either. When something wrong happens and you are in a position to respond to it, you can respond to it. You do not need a system or a strategy or a publicist. You need a decision and a direction and the willingness to walk through a door. Clapton walked through the door. Harold got a phone call that evening. Peter Marsh took off his headphones and came downstairs. And in a modest flat in Bermondsey, a 71-year-old blind veteran who had called a radio station to say something true and been laughed at, found out that the something true had been heard by exactly the right person, who had gotten in his car and driven to Soho to make sure it was acknowledged. Some things are worth driving to Soho for. Harold's true thing was one of them. Clapton did not demand an on-air apology. He did not bring a publicist or a camera. He walked in alone, said what he came to say in 4 exchanges, and walked out. He did not call a journalist afterward. The story traveled on its own because the people who witnessed it understood they had seen something worth passing on. Harold Webb is the reason any of it happened. He called a radio station at 71 years old, having never done so before, to say something true. He waited 22 minutes on hold. He said the true thing precisely was laughed at and the call was cut off. And because he said it clearly enough that the right person heard it 3 miles away, everything that followed became possible. The true things are always worth saying. You never know who is listening, and you never know who might walk through the door.